All right, welcome back to school history, students. The good news is that we have 5 weeks left of school. We are 7/8 of the way finished with the school year. Woohoo! And you guys are doing great. I hope this last 5 weeks is wonderful for you. Let's get right into history. Today we're going to be learning about a new map, the African Landforms map, the very last map of the year. We are also going to be talking about Hannibal and the Punic Wars. Oh, and just to give you a heads up for the rest of the year, you have one map quiz, one history test, and one more project. And then the rest of the things are just the regular daily readings and homework and all of that. But lots of fun stuff still to learn about, especially as we get to this part of the year. A lot of Roman Empire history and then, of course, some other things. On Thursday, we'll be talking about the Han Dynasty and also the Maccabean Revolt, which is where the idea of Hanukkah comes from. Okay, but first to homework. First of all, when you finish watching this video, I want you to go and answer a question in Google Classroom to show that you watched the video. Second of all, you have some writing homework rather than doing note cards for the next section. I want your writing homework to be in reflection on, again, this particular video. Pretend that you are a soldier in Hannibal's army. Write a diary entry about a day with his army. Now typed up, I'm thinking a half page to a page, double spaced, which is, some of you guys would easily surpass it. For some of you, that's just to give you a target so you don't write just a sentence or two. Third of all, there are some note cards here. I'm not going to embed the note cards in the lesson, but they are in the next slide, and you can pause and just copy them down right now if you'd like to. So if you want to do that, make sure you have 5 empty note cards right now. And if you also need to have your textbook out, open to lesson 91, which in the old-fashioned book is page 400. So you're going to copy these note cards from lesson 91. There's no place on Google Classroom for you to upload those. You are copying these note cards because you are now collecting your information for the last test of the year. So you need to keep up with all that information. And then finally, but still important, you need to read lessons 92 and 93. That prepares you for Thursday. Here are the 5 note cards. If you want to go ahead and copy those right now, there for this lesson we're about to do, just press pause. On my computer, it's the space bar, but press pause and you can copy those. All right, let's start with our final map, the African Landforms map. You see here on the right a picture, and all of the things that are written on the page are the things that you're supposed to learn. And I am going to take some time. Here on the left, there's a list of them. There are some things that you'll notice that are very familiar, like the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea. But I'm going to go over some of the things that are new to you because I want you, in your imaginations, to be able to picture the beautiful world that we have. It's not always beautiful, but parts of it are really beautiful. And I want you to think, in the future, you might get a chance to travel. If you travel, where might you go? You could go some places for beauty's sake. You also might go some places because there's a real reason and a real purpose. My husband lived for a while in Nigeria, which is over here in this section. It is not the most beautiful part of Africa, but it is a place in Africa that has a lot of need. And there's some wonderful, wonderful people, wonderful Christians doing great work there. But if you were going to go visit the most beautiful parts of Africa, you would probably go over here to the eastern side of Africa. But let me show you some pictures. Okay, up close to the Mediterranean Sea in the northern part of Africa, we find the Atlas Mountains. They're in Morocco. and they are in between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sahara Desert, which means that they act as a weather barrier between the very lovely temperate climate of the Mediterranean Sea and the harsh desert climate of the Sahara. Aren't these, isn't this really beautiful though? The towns that are just dropped down in the middle of the Atlas Mountains. Now, speaking of the Sahara Desert, almost every movie you've ever seen that has a picture of people stumbling across the desert use the Sahara Desert as the model. It is a quintessential desert. It is the Earth's largest hot desert. And when I say hot, you know what that means? That means that Antarctica is actually a larger desert and the Arctic tundra, but they are cold deserts. The Sahara Desert is a sandy, hot desert, which is famous for its sand dunes. It does have a few oases where water runs down underground from the Atlas Mountains and comes into the Sahara Desert. But it is the kind of place that just goes on and on with the sand dunes. Here's another desert. This one is far, far, far south, but it is also strikingly beautiful. The Namib Desert is a desert that is known for its tall, spectacular sand dunes that run right up into the Atlantic Ocean. Some of these sand dunes are 980 feet high and 20 miles long. I know that you think this is a painting, right? But look down at the corner there. This is photography, and this place in the Namib Desert really is this gorgeous. Very close to the Namib Desert is the Kalahari Desert, which is not a desert at all. The Kalahari Desert is semi-arid. It's not a true desert. So it's actually what's called a flat and sandy savanna. Some of you, I think, studied some geography in your past life, and a savanna is a perfect description of this. Now, you notice here, look at the flatness. This is also, as much as we think of the sand dunes, we also think of the flatness with a desert. In this one, there are not only trees, but there's bushes, there's animal life. There's a lot more in the Kalahari than just sand dunes. A couple of rivers. The Niger River and the Congo River. The Niger River is in West Africa, over in the section I showed you where Mr. Doroko had lived. And the Congo River is down in the southern part of Africa, sort of. The Niger River is the main river in West Africa for drinking water and for irrigation. West Africa really depends on this. The Congo River is the second largest river in the world, next only to, do you know? The Nile. It's named after the Kingdom of Congo, but that's Congo with a K. And the Kingdom of Congo was in it at the same time as the era that we call the Middle Ages. But it was what was happening in Africa at that time. The Nile River, which is, as I told you, the longest river in the world, it flows from south to north. So look down here and you can see Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria in Uganda is a reservoir for the Nile River. Here in Ethiopia, here's another reservoir. And from these reservoirs, the Blue Nile flows and the White Nile flows. They join together here in Sudan, and then they flow down through the part of the Nile that's most famous, through Egypt into the Nile Delta region, and then into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile River is something that we've talked about before, and you guys have seen videos of too. This is amazing. This is probably, I think, one of the most spectacular things in Africa. The Victoria Falls. Named so by Dr. Livingstone, I presume, David Livingstone, who was exploring as a doctor and a missionary, and he named Victoria Falls after Queen Victoria. This is the world's largest waterfall and is considered one of the 7 wonders of the natural world. During rainy season in Africa, the water is like this. You can see how the river comes down and then just dumps over that crevice, which was split on the earth with some pretty massive land forces long ago. But the water comes over the edge there. In the dry season, people can walk out on parts of that waterfall. It dries up a bit. This is such a spectacular thing that I gave you 2 pictures. I wanted you to see how amazing it is. I just think it would be a dream one day to be able to see the Victoria Falls. This is Victoria Falls is the barrier between 2 different countries. So it's kind of like a country border too. All right, Lake Victoria is nowhere near Victoria Falls and not connected to it at all. But Lake Victoria is the 2nd largest freshwater lake in the world. Anybody know what the largest freshwater lake is? We studied it in our North American landforms map. It's one of the Great Lakes. It's the one called Lake Superior. But Lake Victoria is a very, very large freshwater lake. Freshwater, so it has a ton of fish. It's used by these neighboring countries for I was going to say for trade, but really for their economy and their food supply. So people really depend on Lake Victoria. However, it is a very dangerous lake. And it's dangerous because when you get out in the middle of Lake Victoria, you can't even see the shore. That's how big it is. And there are also rocks underneath the lake that are hard to see. So the fishermen who are used to it sort of know where things are and can navigate around them. But it's called black water when there are rocks that are just under the surface, and those rocks can really tear up a boat. Problem is that the rocks are hard to see if all of a sudden a storm rises up and you're being driven around by a storm. And so it's unfortunately a lot of people die every year in Lake Victoria just in these fishing boat accidents. All right, the next one is the Ethiopian Highlands, which is famous. Well, there's 2 that go together, the Ethiopian Highlands and the Great Rift Valley. Now, I'll put them together because they are on an enormous fault line, FAULT, a fault line where in the past there were a lot of earthquakes and volcanoes. And you'll notice that even some of the mountains were formed by volcanic activity here. But these are spectacular geographical formations. You can see a little bit from this picture I included, but the Ethiopian Highlands have so much variety that one picture doesn't even do it justice. I want to point out though, here in the bottom left, there are over 1,200 of these churches that are carved into the rock. Can you see that? Like there is a rock above that church. That's because this church building was carved long, long ago out of the rock, just smoothed out, and you can go into it, and it's a active worshiping church. And when I say active worshiping church, you are looking at some of the oldest church buildings and oldest churches in the world, because I don't know if you remember in the book of Acts, but the Ethiopian eunuch who was converted when he was on the road, he went back to his country and took the gospel back to Ethiopia. And it has one of the oldest churches in the entire world. They were some of the strongest Christians in, outside of Jerusalem for years and years. So this is called the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. That's the church, and it's so old that it's like before the Roman Catholic Church. And I don't even know if it's connected. I doubt it's connected to the Eastern Orthodox Church. I think it's just its own thing. So super old in Ethiopia. Now, you see this landscape? I wanted to show you also that the Ethiopian highlands are full of animals. Look at these amazing animals. Monkeys, four kinds of cats. Look at the one on the bottom left. Yes, that is a wolf, even though it looks like a kangaroo. And the one on the bottom right is called, I am not joking, a giant mole rat. Princess Bride, anyone? The Ethiopian highlands are connected to the Great Rift Valley. Just gaze at this in wonder. On a fault line, earthquakes, volcanoes, they're all of these. The land shows the sort of old forces that helped to shape it, but then they've smoothed out over time. Isn't that beautiful? Now, part of this geographical formation is also Mount Kilimanjaro. Isn't that amazing too? Mount Kilimanjaro actually consists of 3 volcanic cones. It is what geologists call a stratovolcano. And two of the three cones that make up Mount Kilimanjaro are extinct, which means that scientists don't think they will ever erupt again. But one of them is dormant, so that means that it could erupt again. Mount Kilimanjaro is the highest freestanding mountain in the world. A lot of the other tall mountains are connected in mountain ranges, but because of the volcano, Mount Kilimanjaro just stands there by itself. And it is a destination for people who like the challenge of hiking. I think it's a doable hike. I mean, you have altitude sickness and all of those concerns if you're not prepared, but I don't think it's as hard of a hike as, for instance, some of the ones in Nepal. All right, just a few more things. I want you to know that this green area is called the Horn of Africa. Now stop for a minute. When I say the Horn of Africa, what kind of horn are we talking about? A car horn? What horn would this be, and why would this be called the Horn of Africa? The answer is right below. It's a rhinoceros horn that it was named after. So when you see this area and you think the Horn of Africa, you're supposed to be thinking of a rhinoceros and the way that the rhinoceros's horn comes up like that. Now this is on this part of Africa, way down here on the southern tip of Africa and a little bit over to the west is the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape of Good Hope was named by Portuguese and European explorers who, follow my mouse, came from here looking for trade routes over to the eastern part of the world. So they were trying to figure out how in boats to get around the tip of South Africa and to come over here to India or to China. When they did that, they were coming down this direction, and the point at which they stopped going due south and got to start going east is where the Cape of Good Hope is. It's not actually the very dividing point. It is the point where the boats started to go east. It's in South Africa. Everything in South Africa is beautiful with some tragic history and an amazing place to put on your bucket list. Finally, no, not finally, there's 2 more. Madagascar. Aren't these trees amazing? This is Madagascar looks like a Dr. Seuss book. The trees do, and the animals, and all of the things that you can find in Madagascar. Madagascar has 5% of the entire world's plant and animal species. Now I want you to try to do a little math problem here. 5% of the species in the entire world, but 80% of those are only in Madagascar. So let's try to do the math. What is 80% of 5%? 80% of 5%, you do it like this. 80%, turn it into a decimal, 0.8 of, that's times, 5% is 0.05. 0.8 times 0.05 is, if you want to figure it out yourself, then I will give you a second, or you can just pause. Okay? Did you figure out what it was? It's 4%. So 4% of the plant and animal species in the world are only in Madagascar. Half of the world's chameleons are there, and lots of lemurs, but guess what? No tigers, no giraffes, and no hippos. There's a chameleon. Finally, the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was not dug until, well, it was dug in the mid-1800s. It was opened in 1869. And it was done, this is back in the days when the sun never set on the British Empire. And the British had holdings in India. So they were looking for a way to get from India, right here, that's what Mumbai means, they wanted to come through the Red Sea. They wanted to get into the Mediterranean Sea and cut off, 5,000 miles of sea travel. Plus, it's a lot easier to be in the Mediterranean Sea, to be in the open ocean with boats. It is one of the most important shipping lanes in the world, even today, for shipping. Now, you can see that when the British Empire no longer ruled the whole world, this would still be a much faster way to come into Italy or Greece or really anything in the Mediterranean Sea area also. So here is what I wanted to ask you before we switch to lesson 91. If you were going to Africa, where would you want to visit? There's so many things, so many options, so many places I just told you about. What is on your bucket list? Where would you love to go? Okay, don't forget to go to Google Classroom and respond to the question there. But you need to listen to the rest of the video for your homework for the second part. So look in lesson 91, and I am going to start by telling you some stories before this, and then we'll go on to reading lesson 91. This is a lead up to Hannibal. I'm actually starting with Alexander the Great. Remember how Alexander the Great left his empire to his generals? I'm going to tell you what happened. It was a mess. One of the generals was Ptolemy. Now, we'll call him Old Ptolemy because he was getting older and older, but he was still ruling a chunk of Alexander the Great's empire. Old Ptolemy had a son who was a troublemaker. Hold that idea, and I wanted to tell you that back in these days, everybody married off their daughters for alliances. Ptolemy did that with his daughter Arsinoe. He married her off to one of the other old generals, Lysimachus. So Lysimachus, who was a good 30, 40 years older than Ptolemy's daughter Arsinoe, nevertheless, she had a couple of sons, and she wanted those sons to rule after her old husband. She also didn't want her old husband's other sons to end up getting the kingdom. So she and her troublemaking brother, young Ptolemy, see, same name, young Ptolemy tricked Lysimachus into poisoning his son by, of course, sowing the seeds that he was trying to steal the kingdom. And then young Ptolemy went over and talked to another one of the generals, Seleucus, and talked him into marching against Lysimachus because he said, can you believe Lysimachus poisoned his own son? So now Seleucus is going after Lysimachus. At this point, they're both very old. Seleucus was 80 years old. Lysimachus was 71. And they had known each other for over 40 years as officers under Alexander the Great. Well, hand to hand, they fought in combat. Actually, those two old men fought hand to hand, and the 80-year-old Seleucus killed the 71-year-old Lysimachus. But as soon as Seleucus got back to his war camp, his army camp, young Ptolemy just killed him, claimed the throne, and then married his own sister. So now two of the generals are dead. Young Ptolemy has married his sister, but he wasn't even satisfied to be the ruler here in this way. He went and killed his sister Arsinoe's two sons so they wouldn't challenge him. Well, Arsinoe up and left her brother, and went down to another part of the world where her other brother was. This is closer to Egypt, and went and married her other brother. Now, conveniently, the other brother she married was also named Ptolemy. So now we have 3 Ptolemies. I know that sounds very strange to you, why all these brothers and sisters are getting married. This was an Egyptian custom to do this, and of course it was for consolidating power, but it earned the Greek scorn. The Greeks thought this was a terrible thing to do. So they called him Ptolemy Philadelphus, or brotherly love, which they were intending to say as an insult. But the chaos just continued in the world that Alexander the Great had left behind. All right, now hold that thought and let's look at another part of the Mediterranean Sea, which is the part this map is related to. Rome, right here, and Carthage, right here, were gearing up at this point for a series of wars. It all started over Sicily. Here's Sicily right here. Sicily is that island that when you look at the map, it says Italy's kicking Sicily. Now, at this point, Rome and Carthage were both cities. They were city-states. And Rome had not yet turned from a republic to an empire. So part of what I'm telling you about is when things started to change from Rome being a republic to, after this, we'll see Rome being an empire. This right here was Rome's first overseas venture. They weren't yet into kingdom building, but see right here, Syracuse, the green section, had invited help, but they invited help from both Rome and Carthage. They needed help in fighting off some invader. Both Rome and Carthage were interested in this. Carthage had some holdings over here. Rome wanted to expand their empire. They both got involved, and this turned into the First Punic War. The First Punic War was going to go on for 23 years. Lots of things happened during this time. Rome figured out how to build a navy. They hadn't needed it before. Rome and Carthage went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. No one was losing, but no one was taking land either. Really, nothing was happening in the Punic War. And finally, Carthage just called it quits. They abandoned their general to surrender, and Sicily became Rome's first foreign province. All of that's a nice story, except here's where it gets interesting. That general, the one who fought so hard and was humiliated by Rome, whose country of Carthage withdrew support and forced him to surrender, his name was Hamilcar. Now, Hamilcar is not the famous one you know, but you know his famous son. Hamilcar settled not in Carthage after this, but over here in Iberia, in modern-day Spain. He spent time making a little kingdom there, raising a family. He never forgave Rome. He held a grudge against Rome, so he kept looking for ways to defeat Rome. He would send spies like this to try to figure out how he could invade Rome from the north. And so keep that in mind. Now, Hamilcar had a son who became famous, the subject of our lesson. His name was Hannibal. Hannibal didn't even grow up in Carthage. He, at the age of 9, moved with his family to Iberia, but he grew up as a Carthaginian with a hatred of Rome. I'm going to tell you a story based off the historian Polybius, and I want the story to help us remember how important a father or a mother's words can be in setting the tone for a child's life. When Hannibal was 9 years old, his adored father called him over during an animal sacrifice and asked if he would like to go with him on a military expedition. Hannibal, the 9-year-old, begged to be allowed to go. And the history book reads like this. His father then took him by the hand, led him to the altar, and commanded him to lay his hand on the animal victim and swear that he would never become a friend to the Romans. An oath of eternal hatred was sworn. All right, let's look now at your book. And I want you to look in lesson 91 with me, and we're going to start reading. Far away from China, about the same time that the Qin started the Great Wall, trouble was stirring between two important cities, Rome and Carthage. The city of Rome was determined to rule over the entire Mediterranean world. Carthage, however, wasn't going to let this happen very easily. Carthage was an ancient city and state located in northern Africa, and it was a threat to Rome because it was in an ideal location for trading. Look on a historical map now and find both Carthage and Rome. They were really quite close to one another, and although they were on two different continents, only the waters of the Mediterranean Sea separated them. The fighting between these cities became known as the Punic Wars. It was called that because the Romans used the word Punic for Phoenicians. What do the Phoenicians have to do with it? Glad you asked that question. It was the Phoenicians of long ago who first settled the city of Carthage on the Mediterranean. Carthage is what we would call a colony of Phoenicia for many years. And I think some of you students remember that because when you did your Phoenician projects, some of you did a project focused on the trade, and you talked about the trade centers, and Carthage was a main trade center of the Phoenicians. Back to the book. During the First Punic War, the Carthaginians fought with the Romans over the island of Sicily. That is the small island that looks like it is being kicked by the peninsula of Italy. Archimedes was from there, from Sicily. Carthage lost the battle. That's a very short version of what I had just told you. 20 years later, the brilliant general Hannibal rose to power in Carthage. He would greatly challenge the Roman rule. While just a boy, Hannibal developed an intense hatred for Rome. His father once asked him to make an oath that he would never be friends with a Roman. Hannibal kept that oath his whole life. The most amazing thing Hannibal ever did was to completely surprise the Romans in an attack. You will have to look at the map to appreciate this strategy. Okay, here's the map. Rather than trying to attack the Romans from the south, where Carthage was, see, Carthage is right here. So rather than attacking across this little bit of water, what Hannibal did was that he took an army from here, marched them here through Iberia, his home place, up and over, across the Rhone River, over the Alps to attack Rome from the north. He went west through Africa, north at the Strait of Gibraltar, and east across the perilous Alps, one of the highest mountain ranges in the world. This man and his army, who lived south of Rome and across the sea, attacked Rome from the northwest. It was a brilliant idea. And I'm going to tell you, before the Second Punic War began, this was called the Second Punic War. Before it began, Hannibal was fighting his way toward Rome, clearing a path. He got right here to Massalia, and this city, Massalia, asked Rome for help. And At that point, Rome sent sent a senator over to Carthage to talk to their senators. At this, both Carthage and Rome really were itching for war at this point. Carthage was full of bitter resentment against the Romans for having defeated them in the first war. Rome was full of rage at an unprovoked attack that Hannibal was attacking them, and that he had come up here in Massalia, had asked for help, but he just took over the city. So a senior Roman ambassador came in to the Carthaginian assembly, and he shouted, "I carry war and peace in the folds of my garments." See how his garments were? "I will let war fall from it if you are not careful." To which the Carthaginian senator stood up and shouted back, "We accept it." And the Second Punic War began, just like that. So, back to the book. To make this endeavor even more astounding, Hannibal took 37 war elephants with him. Can you imagine elephants climbing the Alps? To be honest, they didn't do a very good job. So here they had to go across the river. And they also climbed up the Alps. On the way, all but one died. The elephants did, either from the freezing conditions or from falls of great height. 1/3 of Hannibal's men died for the same reason, as well as from starvation on the long and perilous journey. Now, I want to read to you a paragraph from my Story of the Ancient World about this. Here is what he said. His men were a bigger problem than the Roman pursuit. They were mostly African raised, and the Spanish coast was the coldest land they had known. They were terrified by the thought of ascending the steep, unknown slopes, and their first sight of the Alps was no help. The towering peaks, Livy says, the snow-clad pinnacles soaring to the sky, the rude huts clinging to the rocks, beasts and cattle shriveled and parched with cold, the people with their wild and ragged hair, all nature, animate and inanimate, stiff with frost. All this, the other sights, the horror of which words cannot express, gave a fresh edge to their apprehension. And then they were constantly threatened by wild local tribes. In the first such attack, the Carthaginian horses panicked on a narrow mountain trail, and both soldiers and horses slipped and were thrown over the trail's edge to break on the rocks thousands of feet below. As they marched higher, glassy ice beneath a layer of snow sent more men and animals sliding to their death. All right, I'm going to stop reading right there and go back to the book, but you can see why so many of the animals, the horses, and especially the elephants that were really not supposed to be in this climate, died during this journey. Now, if you think it's strange that he would take war elephants on a trip like this, remember how important his father was to him? Guess what? His father, Hamilcar, also had 70 war elephants that he used in the First Punic War. So even though we know Hannibal as the one with the war elephants, he was, in many ways, he spent his entire life and career trying to make right the things that his father didn't accomplish or wasn't able to accomplish. All right, back to the book. Still, Hannibal was very courageous. It is said that he himself would serve as a scout, hiking or riding his horse to the next highest peak, yelling back to his men that it was safe for passage. I can picture him shouting and waving. Both he and his men were subject to slippery ice, deep snow, and freezing weather. It's incredible that they made it at all. But over the next 15 years, the brave and gallant Hannibal managed to defeat the Romans at 3 different battlefields in Italy. Now, I'm going to stop right here because I want to tell you, I feel like the book just breezes on to Hannibal's defeat, inevitable defeat. But I want to tell you first about some of those victories, or one of those victories in particular. I want to tell you about the Battle of Cannae. Now, this is one of the major battles of the Second Punic War. And Hannibal used a strategy which today is considered a classic war strategy, but somebody had to come up with it. And we think that it was Hannibal who came up with this particular strategy. Okay, Hannibal's army was in the red right here, and the Romans are the blue lines. So here, Hannibal generally the other army would expect his strongest troops to be leading the charge to try to break through the Romans. But Hannibal was a little bit outmanned. The Romans had more soldiers, and they were there. I mean, they were in their own land. But he chose the attacking point. He chose the place, I believe, where the Romans would be fighting, facing the sun, into the sun. And he put his weakest, thinnest line right here at the front. But he didn't send them out there just to get slaughtered. He himself was with them to stir them up and to keep them going and to encourage them to fight hard. He put his strongest infantry here on the outside back and on the outside right. But over in front of them, he put the cavalry. And Hannibal had a really good cavalry, much better than the Romans. The Romans didn't even think their cavalry was very good. So when this battle started, Hannibal's center line, which was, like I said, his weakest line, started fighting. The cavalry went around and quickly defeated the Roman cavalry, but the Roman cavalry, the Romans didn't think much of that. They sort of didn't expect it. So now his cavalry had advanced right here, and the Romans pushed back the Carthaginians like this. Come over to the other picture. They pushed them back, and they were excited that they were winning. So as they pushed them back, the Carthaginian line went folded backwards like a backwards U. But what happened was, on these outside edges, the strongest and the completely rested troops that were Hannibal's best troops were on the outside edge. And as the Romans pushed through, these troops surrounded the Romans and attacked them from all sides. So now, where the Romans thought they were advancing against Hannibal's best troops, they actually advanced against his weakest troops. And then they were surrounded, and they were soundly beaten by his best troops and by the cavalry, which was already back here. Between 50 and 70,000 Romans were killed, depending on the source you read, and only 5,000 of the troops even escaped that day. This was one of many times that Hannibal, on the offensive, fighting his way to Rome, seemed unstoppable. Like your book said, that went on for 15 years, where Hannibal seemed literally like there was no way the Romans could stop him. Go back to your book. I'd stopped in mid-sentence here. But he was yet to meet up with the best that Rome had to offer in generals. His name was Scipio. While Hannibal was in Italy, far from home, Scipio moved his men to attack Carthage across the water by way of the sea. News of that forced Hannibal to sail back home. Forced him because Carthage sent him a note, "Hannibal, you've got to come help us." And he was, after all, fighting for Carthage. He was fighting for Carthage. So this was a patriotic response, but it was very reluctant patriotism. Hannibal, his whole life, had seen himself as a Carthaginian, but he hadn't actually been in Carthage since he was 9 years old. When he came back to help in Carthage, he left most of his fighting men in Italy, perhaps hoping to return soon. He hadn't fully carried out his father's wishes because Rome still stood. All right, back to your book. In 202, Scipio and Hannibal finally met face to face at the Battle of Zema. At stake was the fate of the Mediterranean world. The result of this battle was to shape the rest of history. Since you probably have not heard of Carthage, or not very much of Carthage before this lesson, that probably gives you a clue as to who won this decisive battle. Hannibal and his men just couldn't do it. They couldn't squelch Scipio. The Romans went on to claim the final victory in the Second Punic War. This was just the beginning of Rome showing how strong she could be. Like I told you, Rome was a republic. It hadn't yet exerted itself as an empire, but this was the start of that. And this in the Third Punic War. Hannibal, on the other hand, left the army. He worked instead on rebuilding the city of Carthage. He was so successful that again he posed a threat to the Romans. They set out to have Hannibal ousted from Carthage once and for all. He had to flee far from home to save his life. After 10 years, the Romans finally caught up with Hannibal while he was hiding on the island of Crete. This is the same island where the Minoans once lived. Rather than suffer the humiliation of being captured, Hannibal ended his own life in 183 BC. He supposedly drank poison that he kept stored in a ring on his finger. Some of Hannibal's last words were, "Let us now put an end to the great anxiety of the Romans, who have thought it too lengthy and too heavy a task to wait for the death of a hated old man." Ironically, Hannibal's old end Scipio died that same year. Both of these men died without the knowledge that Carthage was later obliterated by the Romans in the Third Punic War. This destruction was among the worst in all history, as the Romans burned the entire city in just 2 weeks. All survivors were carried away into slavery. And as a final act of cruelty, the Romans contaminated the burned city with salt. Why salt? Salt was sure to ruin the land for farming, and without farmland, Carthage was uninhabitable. The devastation of this great trade city of Carthage certainly would have broken Hannibal's heart. I'm going to close this lesson by telling you what Napoleon thought of Hannibal. Napoleon, perhaps the greatest general in the world himself, was a student of history and encouraged all of his generals also to study history and to be familiar with historical battle strategies and historical generals. Napoleon admired many generals. He thought Alexander the Great was the greatest general, number 1 on his list. But Hannibal, he had his number 3. So even though Hannibal lost and in the end is famous for being a loser, he was really remembered for being a great strategist, and he was remembered even throughout history as being one of the historical great generals of the world. All right, that's it. Make sure you go check in on Google Classroom with all the assignments, and I will check back in on Thursday with you.